The National Guard will be under the command of the State Highway Patrol, the same agency now directing security here. But the Guard's mission will be limited to protecting the police command center. Last night, police fired tear gas to stop what they described as a coordinated attack that included Molotov cocktails and gunfire. 3 people were injured. State Highway Patrol Captain Ron Johnson.
We will ensure the safety of the citizens of Ferguson. We will also ensure that peaceful protests will be allowed in the city of Ferguson. We will not allow vandals, criminal elements to impact the safety and security of this community.
3 independent autopsies. That is the medical side of what may tell us what happened to Michael Brown, the man shot dead in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, following what was either an unprovoked attack, as some have claimed, or a tussle between Brown and the officer who shot him. From the medical standpoint, what, if anything, concrete have we learned? And how do we put this to solid use in determining what really happened, or how should we react? Pleasure to welcome into MidPoint the Chief Medical Officer at Cooper University Healthcare, also one of the more popular radio talkers from the great KYW in Philadelphia. Dr. Anthony Mazzarelli joins us. Dr. Maz, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
From your medical standpoint, first of all, we have now heard a couple of different autopsies. What do they tell you, and what are you seeing as to any differences, if indeed you can discern any this early?
Sure. So the 3 autopsies, 2 of which we have some data on. The first is the medical examiner, so the local examiner did an autopsy, and they did not release the full report, but what we have is that there were multiple gunshots, likely I think they say 6 to 8 in that, in what they've released, and that there was THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, in the bloodstream. And then there's the autopsy done by Michael Baden, famous pathologist from HBO's Autopsy, commissioned by the family. He waived his fee, but did it for the family, and he has come out with a more detailed report. He did a press conference. Shows that there are 6 bullet wounds to Michael Brown, and that those bullet wounds are mostly in the arm, 4 of them in the arm, and then in certain locations that do tell a little bit of a story. And then one that went through the eye, through the jaw, one shot that went through the eye, through the jaw, and through the collarbone, another shot to the top of the head. So those are sort of the facts that came out. No gunpowder on the body, which makes you think there's nothing done close range, but of course, Michael Baden didn't have the clothes to examine. The 3rd autopsy will be done at the behest of Eric Holder, and that hasn't been done yet. So the interesting thing is your question, Ed, which is, well, what from those facts can we use to take which of the competing narratives make sense? So applying the data to the narratives, I have good news and bad news. The good news is there's some data, right? And as we always say on my show, in God we trust, everyone else needs data. The bad news is that that data doesn't really differentiate among the narratives, because what you know is that those gunshot wounds make it seem as though either he had his hands up, his hands maybe from behind running away, or his hands in a defensive posture. Each of those feed any of the competing narratives. So it's a little bit of the kind of thing where you can take the position you have, choose your favorite story, whether it's the one that supports the officer, one that supports who is the friend of Michael Brown, who said a different story. You could use the data we have from the autopsies so far to support any of those. Even the THC. THC can be in the bloodstream for up to 40 days. So there's no reason you can't know whether he was acutely intoxicated at the time he was making decisions in that altercation.
Would you say, from what you have already seen, that some of the early witness narratives are incorrect?
I would say no. I wouldn't say that none of them are incorrect, but I would say that there are some common points that you could say, hey, look, these are common even among competing narratives. So in other words, the idea that he approached, there was something near the car, and that he went away and then came back in some way or turned around some way, that's supported in both what the police officers report and in the eyewitness reports, even of someone who was his friend. Now, whether he turned around and charged him afterwards or turned around and put his hands up, we don't know. But we know the common line among even competing narratives from that autopsy is that and from what they said, is that he likely was facing the officer for the majority of times he was shot.
Does the possibility exist, I think I already know the answer to this, but I have to ask, that once we get 3 autopsies in, there will still be not a definitive way to say exactly what happened, or whether he was facing, the hands were up defensively, or something would have hit him from behind, we won't still be able to tell definitively?
We won't. I think the 3 points will all determine that several gunshots will agree that several came from the front, and the one on the top of the head was probably the shot that was the one that was ultimately fatal. But at the end of the day, you know, autopsy determines data about what happened to the body, not what happened in the situation and whether justification, you know, was warranted. So I think there'll be some information like we talked about that will be helpful, but the silver bullet to what happened isn't going to come out of the forensic pathology.
Dr. Maz, a couple of minutes that we have left here. Philadelphia is one of those cities that at times has had its own racial strife over the years. So I'm curious what you're hearing on the airwaves on KYW radio from the citizens there about the militarization idea that's out there, the fact that cops are killing young black men. What's being said by the listeners there?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's this discussion back and forth in which you seem to have a community that was awfully willing to very quickly believe a police officer would shoot someone for no reason. And then a police department that on the other side of that argument was awfully quick to be willing to release data in a way that seemed to not help the situation at all. And in that context, you have a police department that comes in, you know, with the bright, shiny gear, and I'm sure you've talked about the militarization of all the gear these police departments have, and whether or not that escalated the situation or de-escalated and should be seen worse. And so my callers basically were kind of on both sides of that. And a lot of them, there's a tendency really to be critical, I think, of the release, and probably the biggest discussion point, the release of the video of Michael Brown strong-arm robbing the convenience store.
Was that the single biggest fault, the single biggest mistake thus far? There are many others, probably, but the biggest mistake that the local police department made, in your opinion?
Well, I think the question is whether that spoke more to the mind of the police department than it did to the mind of Michael Brown in some sense. That people tended to sort of have difference of opinion about, hey, was that released because we should all have access to this information? Or was that released to sort of feed into the police narrative that this was a bad dude? And so what a lot of people keep talking about is that video relevant? So one sort of side of this, is that video really relevant to whether or not the police officer should have used force against Michael Brown in some way? And the answer is probably not in the police officer's mind if he didn't know. The flip side of that is it does speak to the mind of Michael Brown.
Indeed.
And maybe he believed that he was being approached by the police because he had just committed that crime.
We're going to have to let it go right there. We're all out of time, Dr. Maz. I appreciate it. We're going to do this again real soon. Thanks so much. And MidPoint will continue.